Listen, if you can hear the pitter-patter of the rain, I am so sorry, but it's finally raining in Barcelona and there's nothing I can do about that. Hey everybody, let's talk linguistics. So this is going to be the part 2 of videos that I'm doing about accents in response to some of the comments that I got on my 2017 in review video. If you haven't seen that video and heard me talking exclusively in Portuguese, you should go watch that. And you should also go watch part 1 of this series where I talk about why Portuguese often sounds like a Russian or other Slavic language to foreign ears. This time, however, we're going to be talking a little bit more generally about accents and why my accent in Portuguese can sound vaguely Slavic to a Portuguese speaker. So the first thing that we need to talk about when we're talking about accents is what exactly an accent is. An accent is simply the individualized way that we pronounce the languages that we speak. The way that we speak is conditioned by the people with whom we communicate, which is why they are regional and can even be hyper-local. Someone's accent can vary from one town to the next, especially if those towns are relatively isolated. And the reason for this conditioning is because we learn to speak by imitating the sounds that we are hearing and discerning from the people around us. The first people to teach us an accent and show us how a language works are our very own parents. But people don't generally keep their parents' accents. The reason for this is that we continue on to communicate with a whole bunch of other people in that language as we continue to grow and communicate as social beings. Generally speaking, we talk more like our peers than we do our parents, and that is because we spend more time talking to our peers than we do with our parents. Now, all of this conditioning is based on the sounds that we hear from the people around us, which is also why people pick up traces of an accent when they move to new places. Somebody who is from the South might notice that their Southern accent is weakening when they move to California because Californians don't speak with a Southern drawl. The same thing applies vice versa, and this can even apply when people move between countries. However, our accents are most strongly conditioned by our native accent and our native languages. The reason for this is simple. Our tongues are muscles, and much like any other muscle, we gain a certain kind of muscle memory with the sounds that we habitually make when we're talking in our language. The reason for this is that the languages that we learn from our earliest ages, when our motor skills are still developing and when our capability of recognizing distinct sounds is at its greatest, conditions our tongues the most strongly. This is the same reason that bilinguals who speak each language from a young age are able to speak those languages with little or no accent, but people who learn their second language as an adolescent or as an adult often struggle to completely remove all traces of their accent. Simply put, as our motor skills are developed, they are refined in a way that limits their ability to be modified later on. But that doesn't mean that adults are incapable of learning to speak with any given accent. Accent training is in fact quite common and relies on the principle of building a muscle memory for new sounds. This is also why it's easiest to learn a new language in an environment that's immersive or in which the people around you are speaking in that language as well. It all boils down to the idea that speaking one language will condition your tongue to move around the mouth in a way that suits that language in order to replicate the sounds that it's supposed to make. But you might be asking, what about my peculiar little accent in Portuguese? Now, with all of those things in mind, I am a native English speaker. I grew up in an English-speaking environment in the United States. I have a monolingual family, and I'm in fact the only person in my extended family that is fluent in any other language. But that's English and not Slavic languages. As I was growing up, my exposure to other languages was fairly limited. I would often hear Spanish on the TV, or when I got older, Russian in social settings, but never was I in a sustained environment in which those languages were spoken. In order to explain the peculiarity of my accent in Portuguese, we have to go back to that point about muscle memory. Now, I am a very studious person, and I make a concerted effort to reduce my foreign accent in Portuguese. Many of you have noticed that when I am saying individual words in Portuguese, I say them with little trace of an accent. Simply put, it is much easier to say an individual word with deliberate pronunciation than it is to string together an entire sentence. But that doesn't explain the entirety of my accent when I'm talking in longer sentences in Portuguese. Despite my studious efforts, when I'm talking in Portuguese, my accent is still influenced by English. This means that my tongue naturally wants wants to revert to a more frontal position in the mouth and is naturally more inclined to make English-style vowel sounds. The peculiarity of my accent in Portuguese therefore comes from the overcompensation of those sounds to more natural Portuguese ones. I tend to exaggerate Portuguese sounds to a point where they are less natural than a native speaker might in order to overcompensate for English language sounds. This is a natural thing that many non-native speakers do. Now, I learned to speak Portuguese in Lisbon with all of what that has to imply about how I should be speaking Portuguese. So you might notice when I'm speaking in Portuguese that my vowels are all over the place. The reason for this is explained simply in the difference between the vowel set that a person speaking Portuguese in Lisbon might be expected to speak with and my natural English-speaking vowels. Oftentimes, my vowels will just shift around to wherever they're going to go. Similarly, you may have noticed that I often tend to over-reduce my vowels. From a pronunciation standpoint, this is because in English, words often blend together in a certain way, and the over-reduction of Portuguese vowels ultimately imitates that way of speaking. But the reason that my accent might sound Eastern or Slavic in that sort of a way is because Slavic languages themselves are also more frontal. That frontalness pairs with my English-speaking tendency of more heavily distinguishing between the individual sounds in the words that I'm saying. This has a lot in common with the way that many Slavic languages work and the way that many Slavic language speakers learn to speak Portuguese when they move to Portugal. Although we have different linguistic backgrounds, there are similar tendencies at work here. European Portuguese is much more heavily inclined to sound reduction and subtle sounds in its words, and thus a native European Portuguese pronunciation sounds a little bit subtler and softer than my pronunciation might. It is also true that because I don't live in Portugal, my accent is also more influenced by my own native tongue, and to a smaller extent, the other languages that I speak. When I watch a lot of Portuguese television, I do speak with less of an accent. Ultimately, there are many factors that go into why we have the accents that we do in the languages that we speak, but those are some of the reasons why my accent in Portuguese sounds the way that it does. And that's all I've got for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you learned something or otherwise found it interesting, give me a thumbs up down below. You might think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I make videos about food, culture, and the Portuguese language, which you can find in playlists on my channel or in the eye above, and I will see you next time.